Hello, and welcome to Coach Talk, the show more interested in ideas and philosophy than fact and history. My guest this week is Kabir. He's a lecturer at the University of Northampton and a skill acquisition specialist at Akolyte Esports. We talked about the constraints-led approach, what it is, how it can be applied to scrims, as well as the difficulties and drawbacks in bringing something new to the scene. With his mixed background, Kabir tries to bridge the gap between academia and practice. With anything new, there's always going to be growing pains, but fresh ideas are what we need in Western League of Legends. This episode is once again brought to you by Coachify.gg. So for those that don't know, Coachify is a coaching platform that alongside payments, scheduling and practical things makes tools for coaches. You can set up live VOD reviews, anchor your messages to specific timestamps in videos for future use, and even set up the auto-tracking of goals with the Riot API. While I was working, even in the LEC, I was just using a pen and paper, so I understand that learning a new set of tools can be daunting. But with coaching as competitive as it's becoming, anything we can do to set ourselves apart is a fantastic opportunity. Now is as good a time as any to add something new to what you offer and make it as clear as possible for your players. So if you're interested in checking out Coachify.gg, you can do so with the link below. They have a bunch of free options, which I suggest you check out first, although there are extra tools more catered towards teams and team play. Those are behind a paywall. If you do decide to look into Coachify, please drop me a message on Twitter or on Discord and let me know your feedback as we're working together to try and create the best possible tools for coaches. Lastly, if you enjoy this episode, please like, share and subscribe. And if you're interested in exploring mentoring or any of the other things I do to help coaches in the scene, follow me on Twitter where you can find all the other links that you'll need. And now, without further ado, Kabir, what is coaching?
I love when you ask this question because there's such a wide variety of answers you've gotten across every coach. I'm going to break it down in, I think, a different way. I think coaching, the title in itself, is a privilege. I think there's a lot of honor in having someone else trust in you, believe in you to help them get better. Ultimately, that's why someone approaches a coach or finds a coach. That's the ultimate goal, is you want to help someone get better at that chosen activity. You can coach someone in math, you can coach someone in League of Legends, you can even coach someone at just trying to be happier in life. We call them different titles, but coaching, I think, transcends the title we've given it. The act of coaching, I think, is a very dynamic and social process. I think it's based on that relationship you can have with the coachee, with either the player or the person you're working with. And it's about understanding what they want, why they want it, and what's stopping them from achieving it by themselves. How do they want you? Where do you position yourself in their world? Which leads to like this big answer of coaching never looks the same from player to player, nor does it look the same from team to team, and nor does it even yourself as a coach. You don't look the same season to season, even though you might think, oh, I'm doing the exact same stuff, but as you try and test things, you'll make subtle changes, and over the span of a career, luckily for me, I've been coaching for about 10 years now, I can see a big difference from when I started to now. And I think a lot more coaches are getting to this point of they can see the change and evolution they've made in themselves as well as a coach.
Yeah, and it's important to see that change and to reflect back on it, because if we don't, then you end up maybe not growing as much as we should. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it comes down to this idea of to get better at anything. The first step is like you need to have the awareness that there's something to get better at. Usually, the most profound way to build that awareness is reflection. Most people look at reflection as a way of going back and looking over the results of certain events or their emotions, and they'll use that to inform decision making. I think they're good. I think there are other avenues of reflection, such as talking to your coach, talking to other experienced people who can give you a more objective train of thought. What becomes really difficult, I guess, from the athlete's perspective is understanding what information you should take and what information you should drop. Sometimes that's challenging. And the sad part is there's no right answer. Ultimately, that learning process, it costs time. To learn anything, you need to pay a currency. Nothing in life comes for free, obviously, and you're paying in time. So you usually make a decision, and in maybe 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on the severity of the decision or the complexity of that decision, you'll see the fruit. Whether that if you planted an apple seed and you got an apple, good, you made the right decision. If you planted an apple seed and got a watermelon, wait a second, something's maybe going wrong here.
Yeah, and a watermelon could still be useful, but you probably need to know how you
Yeah,
got there, I think is
yeah.
fair. The reason I like starting with this question is it always gives us so many different avenues. I really love that you touched on this idea of privilege, and there's a story from Greg Popovich sits down with his players and says, "Thank you for letting me coach you." That's at the end of every season, which from the outside seems a bit silly. Most people probably would kill to be coached by him, and also they're of course well compensated. But still, it's that attitude and that way of approaching things that I think is really, really great and a good thing to kind of always have in mind when you are coaching people. You mentioned as well, there's two things that I want to touch on. The relationship and it being so relationship focused, that's been another thing that's come up a lot in answers, the difference between maybe teaching and coaching, if there is one, which of course already that's a bit blurry, but if there is, it's often about teaching is the part where you're just imparting the knowledge and making sure that they get it, and coaching is more about that relationship. So let's say someone's not coached before, how would you go about starting to build that relationship? You're talking about what their goals are. How do you even find what that might be? Because we're often quite not sure of ourselves, if that makes sense.
Sorry, just so I understand correctly, do you mean if I'm coaching someone who's never had a coach before, or I'm working with someone who wants to get into coaching for the first time?
You as a coach, how do you approach someone who you are coaching? So you coming to a player, athlete, or if you are coaching a coach, sure, but how do you do it so that other people can have some pointers?
Yeah. So for me, I'm really invested in understanding what's worked for them before. So I believe that we're all to some extent on this journey of becoming an expert in something. Whether that expertise that we accrue ends up revolutionizing the world or not is beyond the scope of the question, because I don't think many of us as esports coaches or esports players are gonna solve some of the biggest world's problems. But we are becoming experts at something. So for me, I want to understand in their journey of becoming an expert what's worked for them and what hasn't. First, everyone's done some trial and error. To understand, you need coaching, at least in esports, because it's not something that's imposed onto you like traditional sports. Whereas in traditional sports, because of the health and safety and the large scale integration to society, you have a coach from when you're 4, right? And it's just like part of the environment. You get a coach, you don't question it. But in esports, you kind of have to question it. So when someone comes to me, he's like, "I want coaching," it's like, "What have you tried? What haven't you tried?" Because if you've only tried one or two things, it makes very little sense for you to come to me, because you're just paying me to try a bunch of things. These are things you can do in your own time, and I need you to know what works and doesn't work for you. To really work with me, I will take what has worked for you and I will find places where you can engage with them more often, because usually we are already doing the right things. They're normally just getting masked over by other priorities, or what we like to call fires in coaching. And that what happens is we end up becoming more firefighty when we become coaches. This issue happened in one game, so we're going to focus on it, instead of saying, okay, it's part of the process. There are going to be mistakes, there are going to be ups and downs, but there's certain methods, strategies that have worked for this individual or this team. How can we adapt this environment, adapt this tool to then make it fit for purpose for the intention that we're looking at?
And how do you go about doing that? How do you go about working out which are the urgent things that are just fires that we should kind of avoid and look deeper, and which are the things that actually really do need to be solved now? Because one of the problems we have is these really short timeframes, and there could well be things that aren't the best for our performance in the long run, but we need to do anyway because we have to perform right now, this week, this month. Most teams still, I think this is probably true, because there's now so many tiers of ERL system. Most teams are probably only together for one split, not even 1 year. So how do you work out what's fake urgency that's actually going to turn me into just a firefighter, just reactive, and what's a real fire that we actually need to put out? How can you try and find that distinction?
So it comes down from even before day one of scrims. There's some responsibility as a coach or within your coaching staff to sit down and say, this is where we think we would start. This is where we think our starting point as a team is. Before, like, we want to measure our baseline within our first week or so of scrims and see what's functional, what isn't functional, in terms of using league as the example, in terms of what drafts we can navigate consistently, what are our tendencies in terms of, are we more proactive in the early, mid, late game, how are we responding to these challenges. And then from there it comes in saying the development of the team can go roughly three ways. All the players can become better, right? So they all pick up habits or skills that make them essentially better at the game. You either become not worse, so you might not have increased your ceiling, but your floor has increased, I guess. So you've dropped some bad habits, or you become more adaptable. So you become more sensitive to the playstyle of your mid laner, for example, right? If we take this ERL example of which swapping teams every split, so you're going to play against people with different perceptions of the game, different internal models of how League of Legends should be played. So once that's kind of organized and you kind of understand player A and player C can functionally adapt, then it's like, okay, we want to build these things. And that sets out a plan saying these are the functional parts of our system. How can we make these functional parts adaptable, rigid, like consistent, so that they don't crumble under the pressure of, let's say, the game 5 of a finals, or it's a must-win game on the last day of the splits to make it into playoffs. You really want to make sure that's there. And then anything that comes into that firefight usually comes more from like complaints and like that team atmosphere. Are we making a change because I'm forced to make a change, or have I designed and accounted for that change? Is that difference between firefighting coaching? So we'll get into it probably later, but with the way I design scrims, I understand there's a trade-off. I understand that we're going to be intentional in this direction, but that means players might be able to say XYZ is making me feel really uncomfortable. But then it's coming to them and saying, here's the rationale for this. Here's the compromise we're doing. And it's kind of like the activity we did yesterday. We're banking these points for later down the success, for later down the line, because we have some time now. We're further away from competition. So there's no need to just fix this one problem. Patch is changing. We're playing a different team. That problem's not going to show up again. But we have this model that we know is functional for us. We're just going to be so good at playing our way. It doesn't really matter who the opponent is if we understand our game really well.
And the key part of that I think there's still a lot of people, especially in the lower levels of coaching, or people who are newer to coaching, I should say. The key part of that they maybe don't do enough is that early planning, because it gives you the confidence to be able to say, okay, here is where we will flex and here is where we won't flex. Like it needs to be actually planned so that you know what you wanted to achieve and you know what you envisioned for this week, this month, so that when you do flex, you have this weird dynamic. With the clients that I work with, I always do a review at the end of the split. And what quite often happens is that we were too reactive and we weren't reactive enough. Not in those words, but we have basically one problem where we didn't fix it quick enough and one problem where we fixed it too quickly and pivoted. So it is always going to be a challenge, but starting with that plan and having an actual idea of what you want to achieve and why, like you said, so that when people come to you and say, I don't want to do this, like I'm better at this style of play, so we should just do that. You can say, no, we've got that banked. We've got those future points banked. We're going to build up another style now. Do you think that's the crucial part, is doing that planning?
I think planning, like you alluded to, it gives coaches confidence in their decision making. I think one of the biggest challenges I've observed in my own coaching journey, but when speaking to other coaches, is how do I know I'm making the right decision? Right? Ultimately, the head coach is paid to make good decisions. He ultimately can't play the game for the players, so he's not theoretically attributed to in-game performance. Obviously, I know, especially in traditional sports and even now in esports, the head coach takes the brunt of the blame for team performance, and that's partially fair. I think that is one part of the agreement is, you guys play, I'm going to try and direct you, but if anything goes badly, I'm here to like be your shield from like the public eye, right? But when you plan as a coach, what it really gives you is this idea of, this is my North Star. This is where I want the ship to go. Now, the seas is what we can't control. Sometimes the seas will be completely calm. All my players are responding great to my training plan. We're making the progress. Everything's seamless. But sometimes the seas get choppy. And when the seas get choppy, the ship gets turbulent. So this could be players are not buying into training. There's a lack of standards. Maybe we're not just seeing the progress. We're not feeling progress. Maybe we're losing our competitive games. We're not being able to translate it. There's so many challenges. But when you have a plan as a coach, you can still say, this is north. This is where we're heading. So the ship is now turned left, right, or it's going backwards. How do I bring it back to north? Or does North Star look different for me now? You get to have one of those two conversations. Is this still true north, or does north look different for us now? We will see it in organizations at every level, right? For this like kind of hypothetical environment, let's assume everyone is there for a year. Whatever team has a player now, they keep him for the whole year, for the whole of 2024. Some teams will not make playoffs, and the second they know they're not making playoffs, they should then change. Their North Star should change. Or they should adapt to how they achieve the North Star for the next split. That all irons out when you create a plan from day one. I'm not saying you need every piece of the puzzle ironed out, but it does help if you put some together.
And we've talked before we have, and then I've also talked to people on the podcast about the idea that building those training plans for specific moments is something that I think we need to get better at in League of Legends, because while in the long term, yes, everyone should be trying to win, it's not reasonable to say that with this project we're putting together right now, with this lineup, with this budget that we're putting in, the goal is to be playing the best we can during Worlds time, because only 3 teams from Europe are going to make it. So it's an incorrect time to peak for 70% of teams. So making sure we know like when we're actually aiming for in different stages. And yes, in the very, very long term, your North Star might not change, but I like this idea of finding times to reassess it and finding times to keep it in focus. It's like what Coach K talks about in terms of culture, where you need some small moments to keep it in focus often, whatever your direction might be. He talks about a map, but you also need to, every now and again, have these values meetings or the equivalent, like replanning meetings of saying, does the direction actually need to change as well? So we get the flexibility of being able to move, but it's not, we lost this week, therefore we're moving. It's more like specific moments, so you can try and balance the two.
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting, because I guess part of my background, I'm very lucky and very fortunate that I got to study for the past 5 years at a very academic level what coaching is and the science behind it. And in the future, I'm going to go do my PhD in it as well. Something we were taught a lot is the general structure a coach follows is this plan, do, review. Planning is what we've just done, this organization of what we're doing, when we're doing it, how we might do it. Obviously, we then have to go and conduct it, and then we need review. This is, I think, unanimous, and I think most coaches understand it, even if they don't call it plan, do, review. However, sometimes I do feel coaching in esports, especially League, is more prep, do, review. It's just, we've booked a scrim opponent, we've seen their OPGGs, we're just going to do some bans, and then we're just going to play the game. And then we're going to review our mistakes. Again, nothing inherently wrong with it. Checks a lot of boxes from the theoretical side, and it can work. However, if that's your only form of training, I can say with some form of confidence that it's not going to... It might get you that short-term success, but if we are in this ecosystem where all these players are moving on and on and on, they're just going to stagnate. It's more talent maintenance than talent development, and the ones who develop, we don't really know why. It's kind of by chance, and we can't really pinpoint the exact interventions and strategies. And I would find it hard if those players could also say, these were the key turning points of my career. These were the key developmental moments that really shaped myself as a player. I think it's quite difficult for them to even acknowledge that.
So how do we get beyond this prep do review? How do we get to plan do review? So we talked about, longer term planning, coming into a split, having an idea of actually what you're going to try and achieve, which much easier said than done for a game like League of Legends. But let's say you've done it. How can we get more from scrims than just prepping for our opponent?
So it's this idea of, again, you come back to this idea of what is our session intention, right? Everyone is getting more and more hot on the topic and more informed of this idea of deliberate practice, right? I think over the course and the development of esports, there's obviously been a big grind mentality of playing as many games as you can, trying to reach high levels in the rank. Again, the necessary evil of our ecosystem, I'd say. But from the ideas of deliberate practice, it's this: do we want to become better? Like, do we want to increase our strengths today? Do we want to shore up our weaknesses today? Or do we want to get better at understanding each other as a team? Those are three intentions I come back to quite often in my coaching. And then for those, I know we've talked about it a lot, but I believe your session intentions lies on this continuum of, are we trying to explore League of Legends, or are we trying to exploit or execute in League of Legends today? And those two things have very different ways of approaching training. If we're exploring, probably the connotation is we're trying new things, we're trying things probably we haven't spent a lot of time on. The practice is going to look messy, there's going to be a lot of mistakes. That requires a very different attitude, a very different mindset to approach, a very different level of commitment, I would say, than just being at an execution scrim. Getting there is multifaceted. I think buy-in is the biggest limiter, the biggest challenge for a lot of places. However, I think that tide is slowly changing, and the skillfulness of the coaching conversation, your ability to create that relationship, ultimately affects how well you can engage in some of these points along the continuum of exploration and execution.
I love that idea of the exploratory practice, and I found so much use from it, especially if you do have that right attitude as a whole group. Because I always tell people there's very different to know something about the game and to play it, or however you want to phrase that. So knowing how a dive might work, or knowing how a lane swap might work, is a very topical one. There's probably a lot of people now. I mean, Yamato made a very in-depth video about it. You've seen other reviews of it. You can probably go back and look at previous lane swaps, all that kind of thing. And you could get everyone on your team to know exactly what you're doing. And I've seen people with very structured approaches, wave 1, 2, 3, we're going to be top side, then we're going to swap, we're going to go 4, 5, 6 bot, then we're going to be back top for grubs. You can take a very structured approach to it, but playing it and feeling it is very different. And so you do need to have some elements of practice where you just say, we are just going to do this, and it's not going to be particularly effective for the game. We're going to lane swap, and because this is the first one we've done, we're going to be terrible at it, and we're going to lose this game, but we need to have gone through those steps of actually doing the thing.
Exactly.
Or a classic one for me was always when I'm teaching teams how to really take advantage of tempo or how to dive. You have to just do dives. Like, we can go over the rules, we can go over examples, but in reality, the best way to do it is we have to dive, and you will die, and then you will see why we did or we didn't die. And so, having those exploratory games themselves are really effective. If you were coming into a day and you're trying to make it fully exploratory, what are some of the other things you might do, as well as just telling people this is how we're going to play the game? So I've come into the day and I'm saying, okay, I really want us to learn how we dive. I'll use that as a simple example. So we maybe give a short presentation at the beginning, we go over some rules, we go over some examples, but then we say, look, today, anytime there's an opportunity to dive, we're going to go for it. Even if you don't think it's going to work, we're going to go for it so that we see. So now the actual gameplay might be, hopefully, different. Is there anything different you do in the structure of the rest of the day, or things that you'd be thinking about? Maybe not necessarily, I would always do this.
So there's a lot of creative ways to do it. I think within that presentation itself, I would probably have a moment where obviously you'll have a screenshot of that dive and saying, like, these are the rules and these are like the conditions of the dive, and if it looks like this, do that. I would probably also say, for this practice, I want you to try and recreate the screenshot as much as possible. And then what we do in the review process, right? Instead of just going and looking at every dive opportunity, I'll say, guys, take 5 minutes, scrub through the VOD, find me the closest replication to this screenshot that we've taken. Let me see. Show me what it looks like. Show me the conditions. Even if it's just the bot laner, their ADC, and the jungler's missing, but the screenshot looks similar, take a screenshot and then just draw a stickman and say jungler here. Because then you can say the screenshot exists, right? This screenshot is technically, theoretically viable. Maybe it's not reliable, maybe it's not consistent, but at least we now know it's an option. We now know it can be done. whether we want to enforce it and make it consistent is our prerogative. That comes down to what our principles of play are, what our philosophy to the League of Legends is. But then moving forward, we now know that option exists, so we can come back and say, why don't we try exploring this route of action? What is the consequence, the butterfly effect, if we actually dove bot here instead of doing this other course of action we opted into? That's one way you can do it. You can add points. I think point systems are a really cool way. Obviously, an idea I'm borrowing from traditional sports, but for example, if you said you get 3 points, you get 3 points for a dive and no trade, 1 point for a dive and you trade 1 for 1, and minus 2 points for a dive where you don't get the kill, for example, then you can say, by the end of today's scrim, I want to make sure we're above 5 points. Then you give them an incentive, because now they're not only thinking, can I dive, but then saying, can I dive and achieve this outcome? Now, sometimes they'll dive and go 1 for 1, and that's fine because they can still win the game, but they understand, okay, cool, I'm happy taking this 1 point because it's still a good dive. I'll take the 1 point, and I'm still getting 5 points at the end of the scrim. I've done the best dive possible, and now what we're doing is we're incentivizing behavior. We're asking them to find the right opportunities and be skillful, not just say, dive can happen, dive will happen. It's this, dive can happen, but should the dive happen? Is there a better thing? It's this idea of, are we picking the right resource to collect right now or not? And that's maybe how I might structure part of that scrim if we're being very exploratory.
Yeah, I love that, because whether we know it or not, whether we control it or not, with the way that practice is set up, the incentives are always pulling you in one way. It doesn't feel good to have that defeat screen come up, even if you've executed everything you wanted to execute, even if you've learned everything you want to learn. It doesn't matter, because you are actually playing a full game, and you're probably playing a full game against people you know. That's the other thing that makes it more complicated. If you're in the LEC, you're scrimming teams that you will play against competitively later. Even in ERLs, you're gonna know the people you're against. So if we don't actively change the incentives are still pulling us towards trying to win the game, which might not be, in our example, might be not going for certain dives. So changing those incentives and being very specific with them, and maybe even making them even more positive is something that I'd always be thinking about. So, the -2 in your example, maybe instead of -2 for a dive that doesn't go well, it's only -2 for dives that we didn't take, like on the first day.
You could even do like +5 for knowing when to call off the dive, because we see so often we're doing diving today, and then they're just going to take every dive, but then mid laners roaming and the communication's a bit scuffed, no one's pulled the trigger, you don't have enough time, and then they still take the dive, and then in a review they go, we should have not taken the dive, this dive is so grief, and it's like a 10-minute discussion of why this dive is useless. But then as the coach, then you go, okay, next game, I'm going to reward you, even if these points are completely arbitrary, and they don't actually change what actually happens in the game. Your instruction actually has a big effect on the behavior of players. I remember when I first started off in esports, I got to know you very well in your content, and I remember you put out a video of talking about when you give instruction or you give praise, why players might go and perform worse after in the next couple games. And it's this idea of the theoretical thing is perceptual attunement. Essentially, what information can we pick up? And our instruction as coaches really guides that process. If I told you, John, let's say I'm teaching you something, I don't know what I could teach you at this point, but if I just told you how to do it, of course I can see you do it, right? You know the answer. But then when I go away as the coach and I let you leave you unsupervised, the next time you can't do it, you don't know what's gone wrong. But then when we give them this room to, if we guide their thinking and we scaffold their thinking, we get them to use their knowledge, their expertise, and mesh it together instead of us just telling this is the answer. So then if I rocked up to training and I just went, hey players, you're leading training, I'm muting today, they should still be able to know how to conduct that review. They should know how to go through that draft, because I've taught them that everything we do here today is relationship focused, is about how we communicate, how we transfer that information, whether it's explicitly through our voice or implicitly by our pings or the way we move around the map and our body language. It's all about that really for me.
Is that a practice that you'd recommend for people coming to a day of scrims and maybe taking a bit of a step back?
Yeah, I think so. I think, right, like a lot of people, I think esports has branded most coaches as paycheck stealers, right? For whatever reason. But I do think part of being a good coach is being this paycheck stealer, because you're not there with them when they're playing, right? Once the draft ends, you can't talk to them. Maybe you can say a couple more words. Maybe you can say your good luck. Maybe even in the URL scene, you might get a couple conversations in during load screen. But in the LEC, I can't imagine once that load screen pops up, the coaches have walked off and there's no contact. So there's very little value for me to dictate how they play the game. Now, I'm not saying instruction shouldn't be used, and there's definitely a time and place for it. But if it's your predominant form of coach interaction, it shows me that all you care about is the short term. There is no long-term development for these players, because all you want them to do is execute, and play as close to perfect every game. So when coaches come in and I say, hey, why don't you just let them play? So instead of deliberate practice, it's deliberate play, and that preserves that motivation. Maybe the practice looks a bit messy, but then you get to see who the core members of your team are, who are actually flying that banner of this practice standard in your team. It's very easy when I'm there as a coach and saying everything for them to just say, yeah, cool, thumbs up. But when I don't say, who will? And that gives me a lot of good information as a coach. It really tells me who are the cultural leaders within my team, who are not the more mature ones, but who are the ones who are willing to step up and want to be the leader. Because I want to give captaincy, or I want to give the leadership to the people who want to assume that position. I'm not choosing one. The spot's open. It's your choice to come in and show me you want to be it. So I think being hands-off is very, very useful. Maybe don't come in and do a whole split of mute, but once every other week, I don't see harm in it, as long as you're comfortable and you know why you're doing it.
Yeah. I mean, that first one is often a lot more difficult for esports coaches than we like to admit. I think a lot of it comes from just the fear of something going horribly wrong with it, or just wanting to have an impact and wanting to be there and be trying to think of the positive spin of it, wanting to have this good impact on the players and all this kind of thing. But I think it can be really, really powerful. The other thing that I think it draws your attention to is that we end up spending by default a lot of our time scrimming, and there's other things to be doing. And if you could have some time freed up because you do actually now trust your players to lead this without you, then that can be really, really effective. And like you say, there's so many other things to learn about how the dynamics work, and you can maybe forget about the game and just focus on the dynamics for a day, especially if you're someone who's coaching by yourself and you don't maybe have people like yourself or a performance coach to be monitoring that kind of thing. You can say, okay, fine, for today, you guys lead the scrim and I'm just going to be monitoring the discussion, or just writing down the goals and making notes about what we're actually doing, because when you're the one speaking, it's hard to do that as well.
Well, I think it also gives players like ownership and autonomy on their experience, right? I think a lot of good coaching, or I think the essence of coaching, is all you're doing is creating experiences for people. You want to create positive, engaging, fun experiences for your athletes. In my opinion, those are the environments that yield the biggest fruits, the however you want to phrase it. And as a coach, you can be really hands-off on these massive execution days, right? On those days where you're playing the best draft you can, because every player on the team should know what the best draft is. Maybe this is my area of development, but I hear a lot of players come back and say, oh, the draft could have been different, the draft could have been that. So if I come off and say, hands up, the draft's in your hands, you guys created this, and then you can say, okay, why are you creating the draft this way? Why, when I'm drafting, I'm creating the draft this way, but when you're drafting, you guys are creating the draft this way. Is there a middle ground? Is one more objectively true for our environment or not? which one, and then you get to even see the differences between how they want to play versus how you've imposed them to play. So you can have a more authentic experience when you go hands off in that practice environment sometimes. I think there's real beauty in that and seeing what that looks like.
And I think another positive that we should never undervalue is just the variety. You can have a day of, we called it on Solary, we called it captain's run or captain scrims or something, because that's what we call it in rugby. So having that day that's like, okay, this is going to be a bit different. It's probably going to be a little bit more silly, maybe, by the end. It's probably going to be a bit more focused on the details, which is something that players tend to enjoy a lot more than coaches, a bit more focused on the micro stuff. But it's just different, and that's always going to be a good thing.
Yeah, like when I was coaching 42 in NLC Div 2, some way to introduce variety is just get a wheel spinner. I put all the players' names down. I just spun the wheel. Whoever it landed on, all right, you're leading the draft. Everyone mutes. No one can say a word to him, and he just has to pick 5 champions and do all the bans. Let's just see how much he understands what we like to do. We've now spent 6 weeks together. We've gone through 10, 15 officials. We've done a bunch of drafts. We've had a lot of complaints. We've had a lot of success in some drafts. We found our things. So let's see what we remember, what we've retained, what we think works. There's so many ways you can do that. And then next game, spin another person. You just give them that ownership, and then you can say, I think this is the best thing. And I understand players will be like, I don't want to play this champion, so I'm just going to ask for a remake. You have to kind of coax them and say, look, I understand the scrim itself is going to feel uncomfortable. Playing the League of Legends is going to be uncomfortable. But I want to really understand how we think, because I don't want my next game day to look like you guys are telling me my draft is bad. So if you want me to get better at draft, I need to really understand what you guys are looking for. And this is the way I get it out of you, in a productive, in an intentional, in a varied manner, instead of let's come down, let's sit down for 2 hours, stare at an Excel spreadsheet, and run through arbitrary draft simulations that we will never get to physically experience.
Okay. One of the things that this discussion, especially about variety, is leading to is this idea of the constraints-led approach, which I'd love to get your thoughts on. So do you want, just for everyone else listening, to explain it broad terms first, and then we can talk about it?
Sure. So the constraints-led approach, in essence, is a model of behavior. Within its founding theory, which is ecological dynamics, I'm not going to explain the whole gist of it, but what we really value is the relationship between the individual, so the person, and the environment they're in. So what we say is a lot of our behavior and our movement solutions, so the things we do, so in this case, the way our champion moves, is dictated by not only who the champion is, but what's surrounding the champion. So for example, if you were to take Rel, playing Rel in support versus playing Rel in the jungle is 2 very different experiences, because the environment around Rel is significantly different. Maybe the way you max your abilities will be different. The way you build items will be different, because not only are we playing in a different lane, but the pieces of information that guide our decision making are different. Now, as it says in the name, the constraints-led approach, we look at this idea of constraints. These are basically the boundaries or the parameters that puts our action in process, I guess, if I was to explain it simply. So the constraints in itself are 3 ways. You have individual constraints. So I'm probably going to move to a more traditional example here, like traditional sporting example, just to contextualize it. So think of your individual constraints as your height, your body weight, maybe your stamina. That will affect how well I can play basketball, right? Because I'm 5'11", I will shoot a certain way. But if I have someone who's 6'2" in front of me, that will instantly change how the way my body moves and in the goal of scoring a basket. That's the problem I'm trying to solve for. Now, my environment will change. So, for example, if I'm playing on a cold day versus a hot day, will be different. In League of Legends, the environment changes quite rapidly. The map changes with Dragon. You have Baron Power Play. These are environmental changes. Playing on stage versus playing in your team facilities versus playing at home. These are all micro changes to your environment. and then your task is the most common thing. It's what you're doing. So in League of Legends, the task can be broken down into kind of the section of the game. So your early game, mid game, late game. You can also talk about the smallest objective. So are we laning? Like, are we trying to get a minion? Are we trying to get a tower? Are we trying to get a reset? Those are tasks, and we can kind of change where these boundaries lie, and small and large changes can have a big butterfly effect on that behavior. If that is a small enough synopsis of what the constraints-led approach could be.
Okay, so how can we make use of this as coaches?
So I recently wrote a case study where we looked at applying the constraints-led approach in League of Legends, and we did some very basic stuff. We've done things that maybe not are like completely new, and I've heard other coaches use it. So one thing we did was we used no comms. So we went to scrims, and at certain windows of the game, we limited players' ability to talk to each other. Now, many people will be like, why did you do that? On stage, you're not going to be asked to play without comms. I fully recognize that. And it kind of goes against the grain of one of the principles of CLA, which is representative learning design. And I guess we'll wrap back to that. But then when we apply this no comms, what we're seeing is, one, there's an emotional response to not being able to talk to your players, not being able to talk to your teammates when playing the game. It's more chaotic, it's more stressful, it's more challenging. If we go back to the idea of a dive, being able to dive with comms and without comms are two very different emotional experiences. I'm willing to gamble a good amount of money that if you were to strap someone on a heart rate monitor and make them conduct a series of dives while being able to talk to their teammates and not, there'll be a different physiological response. Now, when we come back to it, you can also apply constraints by limiting how they do things on the game. So, for example, forget the practicality of it, but you can tell all your players, you can't level your ultimate at level 6, you have to level it at level 7. That will have a big change in how they play the game and how they interact with League of Legends. Whether it's a positive learning change or not is beyond, again, it's subjective to the coach and their philosophy. But these are how you might introduce constraints. So I also did play scrims without using wards. How does that change your behavior? How do you then gather information and make decisions? And you can be very creative with this. I know you yourself have spoken about the use of constraints previously at Solary. So would love to hear about your experiences there first.
Yeah, I mean, the thing for me is it's always tied back to this exploratory versus execution. And so when we were talking about dives in general with the exploratory practice, for me, the first stage is kind of to get as much data as possible. And again, I'm thinking about data in terms of them playing it rather than just knowing things about it. So when we were talking about incentives, a big one for me is when we're first starting, or we're, let's say, fully exploratory, if it's a scale. If we're fully exploratory, I want no incentives to push us to not do the thing that we're trying to learn about. So if it's dives, that's why I was saying maybe you just have, instead the only negative is when we miss an opportunity to try a dive. Even if we all agree that it would fail, technically I can show you this clip and we'll say, right, we could have dived there. That means we should have tried, because we want failed dives as well. And we want to be able to come back afterwards and actually see the play and say, okay, in this situation, mid lane was roaming and we didn't have time to execute the dive. But hopefully, if we do this enough, there will be situations where you can do it. And you look at teams like T1, for example, they, with specific comps, like with these pick comps, especially last year that they used to run, they play to like the absolute limit and they find picks on people who think they're safe. And only T1 knows you're not safe. Whoever it is making the call, probably Faker, but whoever, like they're the only people who know. And the reason is because they've seen those experiences and they've played those experiences more specifically. So finding an area of the game that I can get the team to consistently repeat so that we can learn as much about it as possible is really, really useful. And that's where, I wouldn't have called it constraints in the past, but that's where they came in so valuable, where when we're trying to learn a certain thing, I say, right, we're just going to force that thing to happen. Even if it's going to be worse for us winning the scrim, we're going to force that to happen. So I would call this diving thing a constraint. It's like, right, today, anytime a wave crashes into a tower and we've got people there, we're going to dive. Now that's probably too extreme a constraint. Maybe you say any time that a wave is crashing in and we're outnumbering them, you're just going to have to dive. And a bunch of these are not going to work, and we're going to find some stuff out, and we're going to organize things. And also then you can even start to get people in that exact situation to change how they're pathing and stuff like that. So the big thing with lane swaps, for example, that we see when teams less practiced, I'll say that, the nice way of saying it, teams that are less practiced do lane swaps, is that they don't put enough emphasis on being there at the right time. And if you were to have this constraint, especially if people did buy in, that we are going to dive if we're outnumbering, then your AD carry suddenly needs to say, there's two of us crashing a wave in bot, but we are going to fail this dive 1v2. So you need to be here so we don't fail it, because we're doing it anyway. Because that situation will happen in lane swaps, for example, where if you're not there, or you're not there exactly at the right time, and the enemy top laner can get a few minions and get to level 2, suddenly you can lose the game on that. And so having these constraints where they haven't really been that extreme in the past, but forcing people to do more dives so that we know more about dives, or forcing lane swaps, even in situations where lane swaps don't work. My first thing, I'm old enough that I was playing and coaching during lane swaps, but let's say I wasn't. My first thing when I see this becoming another tool available to us is, right, we're just going to force lane swaps. And firstly, we'll copy G2's comp where they lane swap successfully, but then let's do different things. So they did it with Sion, they did it with Zach, Nip did it with Udyr, but how do we know that those are the champs that you can do it on? We have to force it and see. Yeah, we have to force it and see it not work. So that's where constraints is really useful for me.
It's this idea of like, and even if the academic textbook might say telling them to dive every time is not theoretically constraints, but it doesn't matter, right? And I want coaches to understand that I'm not here saying that this is like this golden pill to coaching. 90% of coaches use the principles of constraints-led approach without calling it constraints-led approach. The value I offer here as that skill acquisition specialist really is, if you come to me and you really understand the science and the theory behind constraints-led approach, you now understand exactly what you're doing as a coach. It informs your behavior. It informs that plan. It informs what you're observing in the do, and it informs how you conduct the review. By understanding the theory, and this is where it's kind of like the preaching to the choir a little bit here, but if you take the time to speak to and understand the science behind some of these tools that we use, you're again more confident in how you use it. You understand the utility. Now, I do have to admit that there are significant challenges when using CLA, and some of them aren't very easy to overcome. Probably the most apparent is the lack of a customizable practice tool. However, I still don't think that should stop us. I still think there are creative ways, maybe not the most effective, maybe we don't get the biggest yield, maybe not the biggest bang for a buck, but there's still ways we can implement it. I also think to implement CLA, the most ideal circumstance is when you have as much control over the practice environment. So it's, in this case, all 10 players. I do wish there was a bit more of a culture of coaches coming together and saying, we're going to scrim each other in a week's time. Can we agree that this is our intentions for both teams? Because usually teams have conflicting training intentions. It's very hard to judge. And I actually came up with a game to actually train diving. And it's this idea of you do your 2 drafts, but you will pick a topside dive for one team, and you'll pick a bot side dive for one team. So you're already giving the junglers incentives to be on opposite side of the maps, right? To promote more dives. But here are the rules of the game. You can dive whichever lane, but if you, let's say you're blue side, you're diving top. If you can kill the top laner twice before your bot lane dies twice to dives, you win the game, and that's the scrim. Now there's a time pressure, there's a time crunch. And now there's actually a way to play the game. You can either win the game by killing the top laner twice, or you can win the game by blowing up the Nexus and defending your bot lane by getting dove twice. So which one do you want to take? I'm giving them the freedom of choice while still giving them a session intention to focus with. Again, really hard to find 10 players and another coach who wants to come into this way of practice, but maybe with the rose-tinted glasses I have, I think that's a beautiful way to practice, and that could help add variety, add some effectiveness, and add some quality over a very congested training schedule for a lot of players in esports.
And I think even if you don't get that extreme with it, it's still a very useful exercise to kind of take yourself through. And when we talked about plan, do, review before, or even looking at like the practice model kind of thing, I think something that we don't do, or we kind of take the easy way out almost in esports, is actually ask ourselves in that planning, what is the most effective way to set up practice? So we look at a problem and we say, right, this is the biggest problem for our team. Then the next step is you set up a goal or something that we can aim towards. That's a step on that, solving that problem, or it's the whole problem. Something that we can actually create a system around that can be repeatable so that we can consistently execute on this thing. If we're failing how we control, or we're missing opportunities to take Dragon when we have Prio, like how do we set up a goal for that? But then the next question that people don't ask themselves is, what is the most useful practice to achieve that goal or to learn about that goal? Because we don't have specific tools and because we mostly just have to scrim, I still think it's an important step. And I always talk to my clients about asking yourself that step, even if the answer 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, the answer might be scrims for you. It's still worth asking yourself that question, what is the most useful way that we can set up practice to learn the thing that we're trying to learn? And there I do think people can start to get more creative. And I think we're a long way away from, unless you were all in the same organization, we're a long way away from practice partners where we're okay doing that level of different game. But there's definitely areas that we can look at. I mean, the classic one that you hear a lot about in this is when it's blitz scrims. But what people have, I think, thought of blitz scrims almost as a separate thing, which I do think, again, is a separate conversation, has a space as a separate thing. But in this way of thinking, the idea would be if your goal is entirely based around the first 15 minutes of the game, the biggest area we struggle is the first 15 minutes of the game, then can we set up practice to get more reps of that? You know, and that's where you do blitz scrims. You don't do it because it's Monday and we do blitz scrims every other Monday. You don't do it because we just fancy it to be a bit different. You do it because that's the specific thing that we're trying to learn. And sometimes it will be a constraint on scrims. You know, the game finishes at 15 minutes, or the game finishes, whoever gets 6 scrubs wins, or whatever random thing you want to put on. Or sometimes it will be, okay, actually the best thing to learn about this goal is to not play the game, is to just watch the game altogether. And just asking yourself that question, I think, is important. And it's worth asking yourself every time, for the one time where you make a different decision than just scrim like everyone else.
Yeah, I think 100%, right? Like if we look at this idea of expert chess players, after a certain while, they don't get enough fruit from just playing chess anymore. So what they have to do is they watch other chess boards and they try and guess the next move, right? I say that to a lot of players that I've coached. They come in and they say, I want to get better at this. And I'm like, okay, cool. You're already master, so you're already pretty good at it. You want to get better? You're already spending 20 hours of your week watching this LCK, LPL Pro, all his VODs. Okay. At key points, every time he bases, for example, pause and just write down, what do you think he will do over the next 90 seconds? Pick a time frame, pick a window, whatever you want. Think about where is he going to go next, etc. And then mark yourself. You know, that's your answer, and then watch the next minute 30, watch the next 2 minutes, and then say, he did do this, he did do this, he did do this. And if your answer is different to that, then see why the answer is different. Go be curious. Now, yeah, once you've done that curiosity bit, bring your findings, bring it to your coach, bring it to your team, and then say, hey, I found this. I think we can solve X problem this way because these pros are doing it. I would like some time. I would like to use some time to go explore this avenue. That becomes like a really good way for coaches as well, is saying, even before the scrim, do I need to do something before we get to the scrim? Do I need to give them a presentation? Do they need to watch a VOD? Do they need to discuss what this problem looks like? What are the variables to solve this problem? So for example, with my team, I did, what are the variables you need to gank? Like, so we came up with 7 steps, I guess. So we looked at angle of gank, summoners, HP, wave state, position of enemy, vision, etc. There's a couple more, and then we just got all the players to rank them from 1 to X. How important is each step for you? We've built consensus, and it gives us food for discussion. And it's not just, I guess maybe this is me being a bit cynical, being a bit negative, but I'm personally getting a bit bored and tired of play the game and then only review mistakes. I think we should look to have discussion without always having material there, because then we can get to the root of a value, the true values of this player. And maybe that's a more consistent way to start your process, to start creating your system and outlining those principles of play that this team will adhere to.
Why do you think we get caught up in this thing of only looking at mistakes, or even this thing of we just scrim and then, okay, we've got a different goal this week. What are we going to do? Scrim. Next week, different goal. What are we going to do? Scrim. Why do you think we get caught up in this?
Well, it's the status quo, right? It's what's been done, and a lot of coaches, and this is no like mistake to them. It's very natural. This was exactly me when I started coaching 10 years ago. You coach how you were coached, right? A lot of us coaches played the game, maybe competitively, maybe not to the ERL level, but I played at university, so I had scrims, and even my scrims were just come in, play the games, review your mistakes, and that's what's been done. So when you then go and become that coach, that's what you think you should do. And no one really spends time asking themselves, how did we get here? How did we all agree that this is the best way? And is there actually ways to evolve this and not saying change it completely, but can we optimize it? Can we make it feel smoother? Because we know there are some significant pain points in our environment when it comes to trading. Sometimes coaches are afraid to enter that discussion of we can change our scrum environment this way. Sometimes they're waiting for another coach to try proof of concept, right? Like, I think a lot of coaches use CLA to some extent, but now that I am being more vocal about it online, having the opportunity to publish research about it, a lot other coaches have messaged me and saying, "Oh, I've used this in my practice and I'm going to use it more. I feel more confident now." So I think we see this lane swap meta. G2, they knew it. Dylan, Duffman, they've been around since season 5, so they knew this existed. Many coaches, when season 14 came out, theorized that lane swaps are back, but everyone just waits on someone else to show proof of concept before they do it themselves. That might be also a reason. And sometimes the third reason is coaches just aren't aware of the resources or the way they can change it. I position myself in the idea of let go of the fear. It's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. I think part of good coaching is to make mistakes. It's equally important to know what doesn't work and what works. And then I want to provide a space for them to understand the resources available. If they do want to change their scrims, what can they do? What problems are they addressing? But also, what problems are they leaving the doors open for? It's a negotiation. By implementing CLA, I might get XYZ bonuses, but I'm also leaving the door open for XYZ negatives to come in. So I have to be very conscious of that negotiation. But yeah, I think that's where coaches somewhat struggle when trying to challenge that status quo.
And it is a challenge, you know. If you're doing something different, you are laying down that gauntlet, as it were, and you are standing out. I can't remember the book, but the phrase that really just stuck with me was no one ever was fired by following the data. And I think the same thing applies in esports and in sport, but just with the inherited wisdom, you know, like it's not actually true because people get fired for doing that all the time. But if you try something different and it doesn't work, it's your fault. If you do this the same and it doesn't work, maybe it's the players, maybe it's that was the level we were only ever going to reach. And then the other thing, which I think is definitely should not be discounted, is I mentioned before, you know, finding the problem, creating a goal, plan, you know, all that stage. Working out what our problem is actually really difficult in League of Legends because it's a snowball-based game and because there's so many variables going on. You could be 1% off in a certain area that's deep enough and it looks like you get absolutely smashed. Or you could be that same 1% off and it doesn't affect anything. It's one of the reasons why people consistently, well, less so now, but it used to always be the thing that we just constantly book the hardest scrims that we can possibly do because the enemy team will show us where our mistakes are, which is always a bit of I always thought of a little bit as a depressing thing to admit as a coach. Like, I don't know what the mistakes of my team are, so I need someone else to show me them. But there is something there. It's really hard to assess what the problem actually is. And then the more targeted that you make practice, the more you are putting emphasis on that specific problem. So if I think our biggest problem is the way we play around mid lane, and it's not, and then I set up the whole practice, so we just repeat playing on mid lane better, then it's actually much less efficient than just doing everything, which is what we currently do. You know, if we say normal scrims without any constraints, without any difference in VOD reviews, is just we try and learn everything. We've got something that we say is a goal, but mostly we just try and learn everything. Then that kind of covers you a little bit if you're not right about what your problem actually is.
Of course.
I don't know if that's too unfair, but it always struck me as something that definitely factors into it, where whether we know it or not, the more impact you are having on practice and the more you are changing it, the more it's on you if it's wrong.
100%. And for me, I think one of the things that I'm getting more and more comfortable with, especially when talking to players, is this idea of it doesn't matter what it is we're doing. Let's say we take this idea of we want to get better at playing around our mid laner. It might not be the most pressing problem, and it might just feel like today's biggest problem as this firefight coaching cap on. But it's this idea of playing around mid lane is a functional way to blow up the Nexus. So today we're going to explore this option while still executing. We're exploring playing around mid lane, but we're picking the champions we can execute on. So it's like balancing that point of difficulty here. They got the challenges, but I'm just saying, if we blow up the Nexus, I'll be most happy if we do it by playing through mid today. That's the focus. You can still do the other things if you need to, and there's no opportunity. This is the idea of having, I guess this is the difficulty of having a really granular goal sometimes in League of Legends, because that opportunity might not come up, right? You could say today's intention is we want 4 dragons, and then in draft phase you have a bot lane that can't get prio. Now you can't interact with it. So sometimes the language we use when setting our goals kind of helps the players have an understanding of what their behavior looks like. I'm a big believer if your goal makes it very clear what the player should do in terms of their behavior, then that goal is pretty useless. It sounds really contradictory, but if they already know how they need to act to satisfy the goal-directed behavior, then you're not really putting your time in the most efficient place possible.
Can you give a specific example? Because I'm trying to wrap my head around what you mean.
So it's this idea of, okay, if I put a constraint of, we go back to diving, right? We need to execute a dive. If you execute a dive within 4 minutes, perfect. You're golden. You win the game. The game's just going to stop. And then you draft Kalista, Nautilus, Sejuani, Renekton, Talia. Everyone knows how to act, right? So you actually leave yourself in a lose-lose situation, because if you complete it, then everyone goes, yeah, okay, well, yeah, we should have done it. But if you don't complete it, then everyone goes, wait, this is a really big problem. We can't even do it when the comp is super easy. So sometimes, like, the goal, we try and give them these really low-hanging fruit goals, but they are actually counterintuitive to what we want. And this is like that double-edged sword of being full focused on just execution and playing 5 games of scrims every week, 4 times a week, and just picking the same draft over and over again with the same thematic. Is if you start losing, that emotional response to that puts your coaching, I guess, buy-in into jeopardy. Because if you're giving them what they want, what they believe they're strong at, but then you're making it very obvious to them that they should be successful, and they're not being successful, then players get panicked.
Do you think there's an advantage, though, to starting as easy as possible and gradually ramping up that difficulty? One of the things that it always reminds me of, there was a podcast with John Danaher, who's a Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach. And as part of their team, they have Gordon Ryan, who's the faker of jiu-jitsu. And when he's teaching people a new move, a new specific thing, they practice it against the weakest people that they have, like people who are new to the game. The equivalent of, let's do this against a team of golds. And then they gradually get harder and harder and harder until they're trying that move against Gordon Ryan and probably not succeeding. But at least by that point, they've had loads of repetitions of doing it in a more and more difficult way. And maybe they will succeed occasionally. You know, they succeed 30 or 40% of the time in that most difficult situation. But he was talking about the importance of gradually building it up so that they can feel what it's like to be successful. So is there not a benefit in the first time we're learning about dives as a team, we do take, or even, you know, we take a real weak side top lane who's just always going to be safe, and then we have Callista Nautilus and whoever else you want, Elise, as the like best divers in every position, and we take. Actually, this shows how long since I've scrimmed. I was going to say we take Rise because you crash that third wave and then go bot, but that doesn't work anymore because of the timings. Anyway, you make the diving as easy as possible so that everyone knows exactly what to do, but so that we just get that repetition of it. And then maybe the next day, or even later on in that same day, it can start to become a little bit more difficult. But now we know what doing the correct dive feels like. Now we have slightly less tools, we have slightly less early damage, because we've got more scaling champions, or we have slightly less CC because there's champions who are better in team fights rather than these small skirmishes. Is there an advantage to that? And just as long as you're not stuck, maybe consistently giving them all the tools and telling them a goal that's like, because I agree, it's like if you're booking weak scrims, for example, and then you lose, that's worse than if you book LEC scrims and you're in the ERL and you lose. But is there some advantage to just getting the reps in your view?
Yeah, I do think I would personally reframe it. Like, let's say we've just come together, a brand new team preseason, and our first scrim, I'm just saying, okay, this is the curriculum of League of Legends, right? We need to know how to dive, we need to know how to use tempo, we need to do X, Y, Z, yada, yada, yada. The first time I would do something, I would just let them play. Just let them do it. I want to see what they already know. But if I give them the first tool, like if I say today we're doing dives and we've never talked about dives before, and I instantly go, you know, the best dive comp at every position and one weak laner to make it very apparent which lane we're playing for, then I don't get to see. I might be already covering worked ground. So I should just let them say, hey, today I want to look at dives. That's it. No more information. Hey guys, today we're focusing on dives. And then we go into draft. Can we automatically agree on what dive champions look like? Cool. We have some agreements there. Are we able to translate it onto the Rift? Are we able to find the right opportunity? Are we communicating it? Now, where do we see the most friction is where I would probably look to manipulate the difficulty. So if I see we are over communicating on dives, I will say, laner, you're responsible of saying dive window open, and then jungler says, coming lane, like confirm. And then I've just simplified the task a little bit without making them separate it from the live environment. I'm just, again, that's like, I've simplified it. We can do the same thing, right? You can give them no dive champions, see can they find dives with not obvious dive champions, can they still create those conditions, those advantages, and then say, okay, we'll give you Renekton, but we're not giving you Sejuani. We have one point and click CC. Can you still make that functional picture look? Can you still understand the variables and needs without the right champions? Because I know when I give you the right champions, you know what to do. And then it's just a matter of pressing the buttons in the right order, which even if you mis-execute, I can't be mad at, because the outcome's the outcome at the end of the day. You're going to make mistakes, and that's natural. But as long as you set it up with the right diligence and the right care and attention to detail, I as a coach can't get upset.
Okay. So it's more coming at it from the other way, where we start with it being difficult and then gradually give them more tools to be able to execute on it. Or if the thing that...
Well, you just see where they go.
Yeah.
So if they can't deal with it, if you can't deal with them, you give them more tools. If they already can deal with it without much scaffolding, much instruction, you make it harder. And I always look at it, every training session you start at a 0, right? Because you haven't trained yet. You don't know what that quality of training looks like. You don't know where your player's attention, your player's mood, your player's energy, and what that's going to look like. Then after that first game, you decide, you make a decision. Do I want the next game to feel and look easier, or do I want the next game to feel and look harder? So then I can +1 or ±1 from that challenge point, and I might implement a constraint to make it harder. I might take away a constraint to make it easier. And constraints could be, I picked a champion that makes this draft really difficult, and I'll just okay, we'll run the same draft. I'll sub out this champion. Let's see if our hypothesis is correct.
Okay. I think one of the things that I'm struggling with that as an idea is, depending on the level of competition that you've got for your practice, which is obviously, again, we've touched on, not ideal that our practice is a competition and so on. There will be situations where you just make your goal entirely unviable, and so you can't learn about your goal in that game. So the example you gave before is like, if our goal is how we play around early dragons and then we draft no bot prio, that's, for me, like, I would just remake draft and say, okay, I fucked that up. Like, we're not going to be able to learn what we're trying to learn in this game, so that's okay, because I always want to make sure that we have the tools to be able to execute on that thing. Because if we don't have a composition that can dive, we will be playing against someone who's good enough to stop us from diving easily, if that makes sense. Whereas if maybe your level of competition was a bit lower, like you're a better team than them, then maybe you can make the skill more difficult to execute from your side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's also this idea of like, sometimes like coaches, players, I think everyone within reason are very precious on how the draft aligns to the availability to that scrim goal, how easy it makes it to access it. But let's say at the start of scrims we said we're going to focus on dragon control, and we want today, at the end of today, in the 5 games, I want us to have 20 dragons and them to have 0. Now let's say game 4 you come into a draft and they've realized all we're doing is playing for dragons, and they make sure they get a better dragon comp. Okay, instead of remaking, ask the question, is it worth understanding how we can delay dragons? It's the other side, right? Now we've spent 3 games capturing every dragon. Maybe it's worth understanding when to give dragons. So now they have a draft where they can get all these four dragons for free. Now, what's the theoretical fastest you can get dragon? Like 22 minutes, somewhere around there, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
Right, like 4 dragons. Can you delay? How much can you delay each dragon from its spawn? That's your objective. That's the challenge you're trying to solve for.
Okay.
It might not be directly related to that intention, but understand, when you're the team playing for 4 dragons, the other team is trying to delay you from 4 dragons. So now, even though you're not achieving the intention the way we designed it, you're understanding what stops you from achieving your intention. Because again, you're playing tug of war in League of Legends, so it's important to understand the other perspective of the intention as well.
Or at least you would see how you would approach delaying dragons, because everyone else's decisions will be very different. And normally, against a good team, it won't be necessarily delaying your dragons. They'll be trading it aggressively for something else.
What can I cross map? When's the cross map opportunity, or etc. You know, how can I maintain the resource when I'm not getting this one resource that I wanted? What's the next best?
Okay, and you would say there's not a problem in the idea of having one of your games kind of pulling in the opposite direction in that sense?
I don't think it's a massive issue. Again, like, I can sit here and say it very easily because I'm not actually doing it right now. Obviously, if I was coaching, it becomes, you really need to understand, are your players okay with this? Are my players going to productively respond to task switch on the session intention? Are my players okay and understand the value it comes from? Because if my players aren't bought into this, then there's no point in me trying to jam it down their throats. But if we can, in environments that I've had some success in creating, I can't sit here and say that every time I've used CLA, I've got no pushback and every player's gone, yeah, it could be a great session. See you tomorrow. There's been a lot of pushback. There's been a lot of conversation on what this looks like for our team and in our practice environment. But it's coming to that consensus, and your players need to know that you're doing it for their best intentions, for them. That even if it's not ideal and it's going to feel uncomfortable today and it might not look perfect, that in the long run, you've actually done it for their benefit. And as long as you can come to that agreement that it's not going to be a 10 out of 10 practice every time I coach and every time we implement CLA, but there is fruits at the end of the tunnel. There's something there for you that you can action and that will develop you. And this development isn't going to be accidental. This is deliberate development. This will help you somehow, somewhere, for these purposes. And we've observed over a period of scrims that this is an issue. We've now built this tool. We're going to implement this tool, and I want you as the player to tell me your experiences about being in this environment, so we can adjust and fine tune it to get the most effective response, the most amount of response from you in a productive manner. And we co-create these environments. It's not just me saying you have to do this. If you have an issue, let me know where you have the issue and let's scale it back, or let's make it more challenging. What do you need? Let's have this conversation.
And you do also have the advantage of building up that resilience or mental toughness or whatever you're going to call it, where there will be situations where you're uncomfortable. You know, you'll start a match on stage and realize that you didn't set up your desk properly. It's like, okay, how are we going to do that? Because I don't see so much in League. In CS, people come out with the rulers and make sure it's all exactly right, which always struck me as a little bit strange why we don't do that so much in League of Legends. People are a bit more chilled with where stuff is, but you will always get that. You'll have situations where people are like, oh, I was actually having packet loss throughout the whole thing, and I needed to deal with it. And it's like how you actually respond in those situations is not obviously going to be trained, but building up that mental resilience, I think, can be a useful byproduct. And especially if that's when it goes wrong, you know, that's we can embrace the fact that we're going to be trying new things, and when they go wrong, we're still going to have some advantage because you need to know what you're going to do when things go wrong. I think that can be very useful as well.
Yeah, it's like I speak a lot about like adaptable expertise, and when people think about like adaptability, they think like this person can just expect everything. He sees everything. But it's not always the case, at least in my experience. Being adaptable is not only being able to act in the unexpected scenarios and being able to navigate those successfully, but it's also being confident and prepared that at some point during this game there's going to be some surprise. And I'm confident that when that surprise happens, not only can I recognize it, but I have the tools. The tools are within me or within my teammates to navigate it. Now, what happens sometimes is the surprise happens and you forget that you have the tools within you and you panic. And then you forget to organize the tools in a coherent manner to address the challenge. And that's when that performance breaks down, and then sometimes you get tilted players and unproductive discussions. But if you just keep it gentle, if you keep it nice and calm, and you explain to the players that even when things go wrong in training, if we just change your perspective, we can always find valuable fruits. We can always take it and run with it, and we can make it a positive from the training, even if the training felt really, really bad.
Okay, so something you mentioned before, you know, you talked about this idea of a skill acquisition specialist, call yourself that title. What is that? We'll start at the broadest possible.
Okay. Controversial title, bit of a, we don't need all these fancy titles, but a skill acquisition specialist is someone who spends a lot of time embedding himself in the research around learning, performance, and like that training environment. He understands the nuance and the delicacy and the sensitivity of change, and the outcomes it can produce. And based on some of the conversation we've had, is shouldn't the coach really be deciding what the training intention is and how it should be approached? Yeah, I agree. Usually the head coach is the skill acquisition specialist. They need to embody that knowledge, but they don't have the time always to dive into the science. And from my understanding, a lot of coaches have voiced their need for support, even if it's in the sense of I would just like to talk to someone to understand why I'm facing the challenges. A skill acquisition specialist takes time to understand that. I'm taking time, and I don't have all the answers, and I also don't believe there are objective answers to some of these questions, but I'm taking time to understand if I was to set up my scrim at 10 a.m. in the morning versus 5 p.m., what's the difference in response? Why would I do a 10 a.m. scrim versus a 5 p.m. scrim? Why would I do a block of 5 versus two BO3s or 3x3x3? What advantages, disadvantages do I get there? Where can we be creative? And I, as a skill acquisition specialist, help map out some of the pros and cons, help guide the coach in their decision making. But at no point do I say this is objectively better than the other. Ultimately, it's the coach is the final decision maker. I'm just highlighting why this option could be entertained, could not. Why we could go down this way, could not. And then I help the coach rationalize the final decision. And that's what I'm doing behind the scenes. I work very much within the shadows. I can, through my experiences and through my expertise, come in and run a coaching session with the players, do a review and all these things. But I work very much behind the coach. I'm his shadow, and I'm kind of just his support system to some degree when it comes to these larger questions we have. Is our practice actually working? Are we organizing in the right way? Why are my players not developing? Why are they not improving? These are big questions that can be very stressful.
So it's almost a bridge between this academic world, this research world, and the actual practical world that we have to work in.
Yeah, like I'm sure you know, I've sent you a handful of papers, and obviously with Watson, he sent you a handful of papers, and sometimes making it through the title is just, I don't even want to do it. So for us, it's taking these papers, breaking down some of the big scary words, and just saying, hey, look, this is what it's saying. Does this align with your values? Does this align with your system that you've created here? I think it does, and I think this is how you integrate it. Are you willing to entertain this journey? And if you are, this is what a timeline of sustainable change looks like for you, potentially. This is how we can introduce it into our next training cycle. It's really helping take all this beautiful knowledge we have hidden away in fancy language and expensive journals, and bringing it to the forefront to the coaches who are applying it and saying, consider this, consider that. Maybe this can upgrade and be an addition to what you're already doing. It doesn't have to be, but it's always good to know that it's there.
You mentioned the language there. Do you see other reasons why there's this kind of gap?
I think the most obvious is there's a lack of context-specific research. So in terms of skill acquisition, in terms of constraints-led approach, I'm one of the few doing it. In terms of esports coaching research as a whole, probably about 20, 30 people in the world, using that as their predominantly source of income, being researchers within the field. So we don't have a lot of context-specific. So it's hard to say what works here because I am borrowing and translating and transforming a lot of ideas from the traditional world. Now, both worlds are unique, but they share a lot of parallels in a lot of ways. So it's trying to find which pieces of the puzzle we can carry on and replace one-to-one, and which pieces of the puzzle we can take inspiration from and then mold. Sometimes there's a lack of incentive for esports coaches to want to interact with the traditional world and the research. And I don't think we make it easy on ourselves. As a researcher Kabir is very hard to engage with. Luckily, my interest in research came from being a coach first. Before I knew there was a world of research, I was coaching. So thankfully for me, I understand that I need to dumb it down, or not dumb it down, but I need to simplify it and really show a lot of actionable insights, because the number one criticism I get is I've read 10,000 words, 30 pages, and there was one paragraph that was useful. So for me, it's okay. Let's go through all these thousands of papers I've read. Let's find all these one nugget paragraphs, pull them out, explore them, and then define them for esports. And that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Great. So one thing that I want to do at the end of all these episodes is go to the quickfire questions. I say this every time, but I'm going to keep giving this little spiel just in case this is someone's first episode. The reason being is, as you can already tell from conversations like this, we all come at it from completely different ways, and that's great, and it's something that should be celebrated. And regardless of your background, if you're listening to this, you can find your own thing that makes you a fantastic coach in esports. So, first question, who are the coaches or people that you look up to either now or early on in your career?
So I actually thought about this question. Every time you ask this, I always think about the answer every time I watch the podcast, and I've always gotten a different answer depending on my mood. So I'm going to give you 3 answers, so to speak. My fictional answer is Coach Carter. Coach Carter is the all-time greatest coach of all time, and I'm not. There's no debate here. Then some of the high-profile coaches that I really look up to from the traditional world is Coach K, Phil Jackson, and Alex Ferguson. All biases included for reasons in them. And then in terms of people in my past, Coach Gio. Obviously, no one will know who that is, but he was my coach when I played basketball back in Hong Kong. He was also the person who got me into coaching, and he really helped me understand that coaching is this relation process. It's not really about the X's and O's, and I know every high-profile coach has said this, but he was the first person who really sat down and said, "Hey, Kabir, I know you're good on the court, but there's a responsibility you need to be someone else as well. You're gonna go away and you're gonna go to university, and having that relationship was like really rewarding for me. And I was like, I want to be that person for other people. I don't only want to make them better at the game, but I want to be that avenue to help them grow as a human being and feel confident that they're going to flourish no matter where they go."
Great. What's the biggest hardship you've experienced as a coach?
The guilt that it's not like a specific moment, but it's like the emotion of guilt that I'm not able to solve this problem for the players. Sometimes I've tried coming at this challenge the team's facing in as many ways as possible that I know, and that challenge still exists. And then sometimes it's like this guilt of, why can't I do it? I've spent so much time studying coaching, practicing coaching, but I still can't figure it out. So it's this guilt of, I haven't done enough for my players sometimes when things don't smooth over as I want them to, and or challenges stay for longer. So that's a hardship that I definitely face a lot in coaching.
And what's your top highlight?
Not from esports, because unfortunately I haven't been around coaching esports long enough. But it's the moment where I can see a player after a year I've coached them, and they come back and say, I really valued our time together. I've had this a couple times when I was coaching in traditional sports. I've seen kids who I was coaching when they were 9, 10, and when I visit Hong Kong, they're now 18, 20, 18, 19, 20. They're like, oh, because of you, I fell in love with basketball and I play for my college team. Or, oh, because of you, I'm on this talent development pipeline in basketball. And to me, that's really rewarding. It's like I've made an impressionable change to this person's life.
What are 3 non-negotiable behaviors that you and the people around you need to buy into?
I think creativity is one of them. It's this idea of, it doesn't always need to be practical, but sometimes it's good to just get lost in the sauce. I like getting lost in the sauce. I like being around people who do the same. 3 this is a really good question. This is like my next interview question. We have creativity. I think this idea of informality is really important to me. I think sometimes when we work in these remote environments, everything feels really informal, and I just want people around me to know, like, hey, it's okay if you just want to call me and we just chat about things not League of Legends as a coach or as a player, and we can just sit down and play GeoGuessr, or we can watch MSI and just have a conversation about things outside the game, and that's really valuable as well, because what ends up happening is we start talking about life, and then 30 minutes later it comes back to League of Legends, and we're not stressed about this conversation. This conversation is really fruitful. And then the last non-negotiable behavior is probably just like relax. If it's not gonna matter in 5 years, let's not fight over this today. Like, I understand, like, tempers rise and emotions get heated, and if you say something like, I don't want to make you feel guilty. Like, if you have a bad day, feel bad. If you had a good day, feel good. But the next day is a new day, so new emotions. So just relax. Go away. You've lost 10 games? Okay, be tilted. But then relax, calm down, deep breath. Tomorrow, new day, new emotions. Sweep it under the rug, fresh start. And that's how we approach coaching here in the Kabir's Corner.
All right, and last question. If you from today could give yourself one piece of advice when you first started your coaching journey, what would it be and why?
Shut up and listen more. By far. It's you have the pleasure or displeasure of getting to have a few conversations with me outside of here, and I could talk a lot, and sometimes my excitement to get my ideas out there have limited the interactions I've had with players, because now I'm getting more conscious of just saying, shut up, let him finish, or let's see if he has something more to add. Because sometimes when I let them do that, we get to the core of the conversation a lot more authentically and a lot more smoother without this back and forth and this choppy discussion. So yeah, that's what I'd say to myself if I could go back in time.
I think it's a fantastic piece of advice. Great. Well, Cabs, thanks for coming on. I love it when people bring something that's actually new to the space. So I'm looking forward to see how it develops, how it evolves, and how it impacts things going forward. But thanks very much for the conversation.
Thank you very much for having me, John.